Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/teacher. Over 180,000 titles to choose from on Audible from your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hello, class. Welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States, and thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know the British won possession of Montreal to pretty much end the war in North America without ever actually fighting? That the Spanish secretly involved themselves in this war, and because of this, Britain was able to gain Spanish Florida. That the fighting at one point spread all the way to Manila in the Philippines, and that by the end of this war, many colonists actually felt even more allegiance and pride toward the king and parliament than before it began. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will learn that and more in episode 34, The Sneaky Spanish and the Treaty of Paris. Hello and welcome to class. To catch everyone up, I want to briefly provide context for our lesson today. So as you probably noticed, last week, at least if you're listening to this in real time, I reposted the Thanksgiving Day special that we recorded very early. I think it was episode 9 or something like that. But I figured it would be pretty topical for many of your Thanksgiving travels. And so I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you went to the dinner table on Thursday night with some historical ammunition for a discussion. Anyway, in our narrative, we left off with the British winning a pivotal battle on the Plains of Abraham and taking the fort of Quebec, delivering a crushing blow to the French. Wolfe, who died on the battlefield, became a hero of the war, but unfortunately, once he died, there really wasn't anyone there to take control of the forces. Lord Townshend rallied the men and was able to maintain control of Quebec. And as I mentioned last week, Montcalm also died after he was hit in the abdomen, passing away at 4 a.m. the next day. After the death of Montcalm, Vaudreuil took control of the French forces. The French considered trying to retake Quebec immediately, but decided to wait just a bit. They figured it was best to take a longer-term approach to Quebec. Montreal was in a great location, and the harvest was bountiful, so it made sense to sit and camp for winter in Montreal, and then once again consider retaking Quebec in the spring. Once the British citizens in London found out about their victory in Quebec, they were ecstatic. The parties raged both in London and the colonies, with the partygoers recognizing that this victory could not be overstated. Of course, with this came the proud feeling of being British, and, of course, that means being superior to the French. From here, it was clear to everyone that the path to victory lay in just holding Quebec and starting to plan offensives throughout the rest of Canada. Keep in mind, this is the 4th time the British have fought the French in the 18th century. So the idea of defeating them in North America, maybe ending this war soon, and kicking the French out of North America once and for all, this is a big deal. Following the crucial victory on the Plains of Abraham, the British wanted to make sure that they kept the pedal to the metal, trying to recruit as many provincial soldiers and native warriors as they possibly could. Now, all of these recruitments are not going to be cheap because, keep in mind, Britain was willing to reimburse each colony for all the men who chose to fight. So, With a potential end to the war in North America within their sights, Britain devised a three-pronged plan against Canada and specifically the last remaining substantial holdout, Montreal. Approximately 3,000 men ascended the St. Lawrence River, with another 3,500 advancing from Crown Point, New York. Lastly, Amherst would take an army of 12,000 men from Oswego toward Montreal. Now, this strategy was an ambitious one, no doubt. Ideally, the French forces from the surrounding areas would all retreat to Montreal, and then the British would have them trapped. Which actually is exactly what happened, but let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. There was a lot more than just a bold strategy that led to the eventual victory for the British forces, so let's take a step back and examine what else is happening at this time that is tilting the scales towards Britain. The colonial soldiers, or provincial soldiers as they're often referred, played a really big role in the eventual defeat of the French. While many of them were untrained and certainly not very professional, most of those that knew how to shoot from hunting, not from, fighting. These men were still critically important. They built roads, they built forts, they moved supplies to and from, and they occupied and held down the forts that, no one else wanted to throughout the war. On top of that, not only were the provincial soldiers actually much more help than the British officers ever wanted to admit, the British scored a huge victory 2 months after the fall of Quebec at Quiberon Bay. The British fleet defeated the French in convincing fashion, and because of this, they were able to prevent more supplies and men from coming over to help the French retake Quebec. Oh, and by the way, there was a second Battle of Quebec, and this one saw the French actually drive the British from the field and suffer less casualties than the British. All they needed to recapture Quebec were supplies and men, which never came because of the British naval victory at Quiberon Bay. The last major issue for the French that we see play out in their desperate attempt to maintain control of Montreal and the area surrounding it was their total inability to recruit support of natives in the region. Because of this, the French either had to capitulate or retreat from the advancing British. The fact that the Iroquois alliance not only supported the British but also convinced other native tribes not to support the French, well, that was pretty much the final nail in France's coffin in the colonies. With the British approaching Montreal, the Duc de Lévis, on September 4th, tried to convince the Catholic Mohawks to ally with the French in support of their defense. Unfortunately for the French, word came back that they had already allied with Amherst, along with numerous other native tribes in the region. On September 7th, 1760, Amherst arrived in Montreal, which was so seemingly impossible to defend against the overwhelming numbers that the British came with. The French just decided to surrender. Now, they tried to negotiate and they used a couple tactics to draw out their surrender, but the British weren't going to allow it to happen. So when they realized that they pretty much had no choice but to surrender, Vaudreuil asked that the French survivors in the region be allowed to keep their Catholic faith, their property, and that the soldiers were allowed to surrender with honors of war, which would then allow them to return to France, and with their return, maybe bring with them some semblance of pride. But Amherst was having none of it. He and many of his fellow British soldiers were likely still a little bitter about the events earlier in the war. Amherst demanded that the French soldiers lay down their arms and that they would be transported to Europe as prisoners of war for an eventual prisoner exchange. On top of that, and this just rubbed salt in the French wound, the French had to surrender their colors. Now, this is a humiliating insult, and upon hearing word of this, many of the French officers spoke out, maybe illogically and irrationally, proclaiming that they would rather fight and die with honor than succumb to this deliberate embarrassment. Because, that makes sense. 2 days later, on the morning of September 9th, the last of the French battalions finally gave up their arms, but they had no colors to surrender. This was because they had burned their colors the night before. Now, Amherst knew that they were full of crap when they started rolling out excuses, but he let it go. You gotta pick your battles. Literally. Now that the British have pretty much wrapped up this war, I think it's a good time to take a moment and talk about the role that the Spanish actually played towards the tail end of this conflict. And we'll cover that right after this. Hey everyone. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/teacher. Again, that's audibletrial.com/teacher for your free audiobook. Keep in mind, you can cancel within the first 30 days if it is not for you. All right, now let's get back to the French and Indian War. Following the surrender of Montreal, the British were pretty pumped, but the war wasn't over quite yet. But by 1760, it seemed pretty clear to everyone that the British had the upper hand not only in North America, but also in Europe. And they wanted to continue this momentum and crush the French as much as they could. The British took over islands in the Caribbean, which helped reignite their trade almost immediately. William Pitt seemed to have this war machine on cruise control until October 25th, when his ally and friend King George II passed away, and George's 22-year-old grandson came to the throne. King George III was actually pretty estranged from his grandfather, and so all the people he had grown to trust throughout his formative years did not like or maybe even hated his grandfather, George II. Bad news for William Pitt. King George III is a fascinating and incredibly important figure in American history and in the American Revolution, and one that we'll get into more detail about in a future episode, so don't worry. But for now, let's focus on the end of this war. By mid-1761, Spain was threatening to enter the war. For the first 5 years or so, they figured they'd just let France and Britain fight it out. But with King Charles rising to the throne of Spain on the heels of the victory at Quebec, he was worried that Britain was actually on the verge of becoming, really powerful, and that probably wouldn't work out too well for Spain. Charles tried his hardest to mediate some type of revolution between the British and the French, but he was unsuccessful. By August of 1761, the Spanish actually came to a secret agreement with the French. In this agreement, the Spanish promised they would enter the war as a French ally on May 1st, 1762, if the war was still not over. But the thing about secret plans is they're far more effective when they're secret. And unfortunately for the Spanish, this secret plan wasn't a secret plan. It was just a plan. Because William Pitt found out about it way before May 1st, 1762. Infuriated, Pitt wanted to declare war on Spain, but King George III was having none of it. He wanted the war to be over, not prolonged. He believed the debt Britain was incurring was becoming untenable, which it was. Eventually, Pitt resigned his position because of his disputes with King George III, recognizing that they were never going to see eye to eye. King George III wanted the war over quickly. Parliament was much more willing to once and for all resolve this potential conflict with Spain. So George demanded that Spain publicly declare they have peaceful intentions toward Great Britain. Let everybody know that this plan that we found out about wasn't really a plan, and that you have no plan. Spain subsequently ignored them. Britain then declared war on Spain, and Spain declared war on Britain. And after this back and forth was over, Spain likely realized that that was really stupid. See, Britain was already in the Caribbean, And now they were just going to turn their attention toward Havana, Cuba, which was held by Spain, and incredibly valuable. The British laid siege on Havana, which actually at first was an absolute disaster, seeing almost half of their men succumb to disease, but they were eventually able to secure it. By taking Cuba, Britain, in turn, gained an incredible amount of trade and treasure. Then Britain decided to turn their attention to Manila in the Philippines, also held by Spain. This one was really easy, because the British who arrived in Manila actually got there before the Spanish realized that they were their enemy. It took just a couple of weeks to storm the city and take it from Spain. The amount of booty seized in this siege campaign was absolutely jaw-dropping. Funny enough, actually, when the European powers were negotiating the Treaty of Paris, they didn't even realize the Philippines had been taken. Eventually, the British would have to give the Philippines back to the Spanish, which they were okay with because they really didn't want it that much anyway, as it fell under a provision which stated that all lands not listed be returned to Spain. And since they didn't even know they had it, they didn't list it. As the war was coming to an end, some in Parliament wondered why was Britain offering such, reasonable terms in these peace negotiations. They were dominating the war. King George III recognized that these war hawks in Parliament were going to be an issue, so he had them removed and ordered to push the treaty through. The Treaty of Paris was ratified on February 10th, 1763, giving the British a monumental victory. But while the British had won the war, like I mentioned, many in Britain didn't think this treaty was very favorable. But look, in the end, Britain acquired all of France's North American possessions except New Orleans, and they got all of Florida. The French got their Sugar Islands back and some fishing land off the southeastern coast of present-day Canada. Whoopee. And the British gave Spain Cuba back in return for Florida, which, pretty good trade. Because in the end, Cuba is surrounded by water. Big water. Ocean water. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to consider the situation that the British and the colonists are facing following this conflict. On paper, this war was a rousing success. The French had been kicked off the North American continent, and Spanish Florida had been handed over to Britain. They had control of all the lands between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River. From the outside looking in, everything seemed to have gone about as well as it could have for the British. And many colonists were incredibly proud of their mother country winning this victory over the French and of their efforts in not only supporting but helping to fight back French forces throughout the conflict. But not everything has gone as well as it seemed. As we will talk about in a future episode, the British had driven up a mind-boggling debt throughout this war. The debt incurred from the numerous wars in the 18th century, and especially the debt incurred from the French and Indian War, put London in an unenviable situation. They had to figure out how they were going to pay off this debt, and they decided to do it by attempting to enforce existing taxes like the Navigation Acts, implement new ones, and cut back on spending. Next week, Zach and I will talk about the effects of these budget cuts, most notably in the form of a Native American uprising, commonly known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Thanks so much for checking out the episode today. If you would like to raise your hand and participate, please feel free to reach out. You can find us on Twitter with the handle @ATeachersHist, on Facebook @A Teacher's History Podcast, And in order for as many people as possible to learn more about the history of the United States, please consider leaving a review on iTunes and subscribing to the show. By subscribing, you can get episodes automatically downloaded to your device. See you next week.